Falter-Podcasts werden durch Werbung unterstützt. Das hilft bei der Finanzierung unseres journalistischen Angebots. Falter Radio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen im Falter Radio. In dieser Sendung hören Sie den jungen Soziologen Nikolaj Schultz, der angesichts der Klimakrise für eine Philosophie des neuen Existenzialismus plädiert. Der gebürtige Däne Nikolaj Schultz lebt und forscht in Paris. Er gilt als Shooting Star der modernen Soziologie. Die Klimaveränderung ist für ihn auch eine Krise der Gefühle. Die Menschen erfahren selbst eine Wesensveränderung, wenn sie unter den Folgen der Erderwärmung leiden, die sie durch ihr eigenes Tun erst herbeiführen. Das von Schultz propagierte Denken besagt, dass neuer Existenzialismus sich um alle Lebensformen drehen muss, nicht nur um den Menschen. Landkrank ist das vielbesprochene neue Buch des Autors. Hören Sie auf Englisch den von Ideen nur so sprühenden Nikolaj Schultz bei der Tipping-Point-Konferenz in St. Pölten.
Yes, thank you very much for attending my little talk centering around what I believe is missing in today's ecological thought. Namely, a description or an understanding of how the human being's existential transformation in a time of global climate change, how that looks like. Now, even if Nietzsche once said that big problems are like cold showers, you have to get in and out of them quickly, then of course this is not an easy question to approach in just about half an hour. But nonetheless, we do first have to take a step back. A step back to taking a step forward. Into a new world, since this is fundamentally why we are gathered here today, because we have stepped, maybe rather stumbled, into a new world, a world that has changed, a world that has turned into something different. Some people call this new world the Anthropocene. Some refer to it as our new climatic regime, while others prefer even more specific definitions. But no matter what term we use to denote this situation, what all of these notions, again, terms agree on is that we've entered a new period of natural and human history, that we live on an increasingly damaged, or increasingly ecologically damaged planet, that the causes are anthropogenic, and that we are facing an Earth that is becoming less hospitable for several life forms, including that of our own human being. In short, things are not looking great. We are living in a time where the habitability conditions of the Earth are threatened, and where the collective actions of humans are the reasons behind, or is the reason behind this planetary catastrophe. Now, in my opinion, one of the most interesting academic responses to this dramatic change, shift of geohistorical situation, so to say, has been to understand it as entailing or unfolding as a crisis of sensibilities. A crisis of sensibilities understood as a crisis in our perception for, our sensibility towards other life forms than humans. A crisis, so to say, in our emotional capacities, our sensitive registers, to grasp the many living beings that humans coexist with, that we depend on to sustain, so to say, our livelihoods. A crisis in our connection to the non-human life forms that, again, we live among and that we live through. Put briefly, according to this argument, then the Western moderns have inherited a dualistic ontological way of perceiving the world that has impoverished, that has shattered, so to say, our emotional responsiveness again to other living beings than humans. On the one side, there was a culture, a society filled with human beings that we perceived, followed, fathomed on the level of analytics and of ethics. On the other side, a nature more or less mechanic, more or less lifeless, a stable decor, and outside that we remained unsensitive to, and that we, with, as we know now, catastrophic consequences, primarily understood as a resource for production. In the context of the ecological consequences, several strategies have been proposed from thinkers to combat, to solve, or at least face, this crisis of sensibilities. Some thinkers have, for good reason, since we were just experiencing the enormous power of art here, have pointed to art as a kind of reconciliation meditator capable of restoring these sensibilities, these long-lost sensitivities, a kind of multifaceted practice, so to say, for re-rendering things sensitive, while others, as I spoke to a person about here an hour ago or so, have alluded to the ecologically unfit ways we have of telling narratives, of narration, of telling stories, both in science and, of course, in literature. But on a more general level, I would argue that the most important intellectual approach, the most important strategy, has been, again, more generally, the analytic turn, the gaze, the attention towards non-human beings in their many sizes and shapes, not least inspired, of course, by the symmetric anthropology of the French philosopher Bruno Latour and his now 45-year-old attempt of exactly including non-humans into social theory and philosophy. Any European or respectable library in a European city will prove this. Today, the library's humanities and social science sections are no longer only filled or stuffed with books about norms, values, capitalisms, power relations, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. Instead, these book sections furthermore feature books about trees, mushrooms, birds, wolves, plants, topics that for way too long, in many people, including myself's opinion, was reserved for the natural sciences. A few contributions to such an ecological analysis have had a particular impact and deserve to be mentioned, since they somehow weirdly have begun to constitute what is a mainstream in a not so, previously at least, mainstream field of ecological thought. Baptiste Morisot, the French philosopher, has counterattacked this crisis of sensibility, sought for a negotiation of a coexistence with other living beings by following in the tracks of wolves. Nastasia Martin has been drawing on her fieldwork in the far north and the sometimes violent encounters between humans and non-humans to propose a new ecology of relationships. Emmanuel Kotcher has famously developed a theory, a metaphysics of mixture, metamorphosis, as we heard about here before also, not least by studying the life of plants. Vincent Desprez has questioned our relationship with animals by studying rats, birds, and octopuses. Famously, Anna Singh has been speaking about a mushroom at the end of the world. And Donna Haraway, who is now cited by the Pope, has been writing manifestos about the companionship with other species for years, which is very strange for somebody who's been studying these things for 10 years, not to say. Again, these are just a few relatively recent contributions to what I've suggested elsewhere to call new existentialism, understood as an emerging tradition of thought that in the wake of the Anthropocene are approaching the questions of being and existence differently. Different in what way, you may ask? And I might try to answer. Different in the sense that whereas the old existentialist thinkers primarily focused on the meaning, the purpose, or the conditions of human existence, then the new existentialist thinkers focus on redescribing what beings allows or disallows other beings to keep on existing at a moment where the human existence is disallowing other forms of existence continuously. I believe that through such redescriptions, these scholars have been absolutely crucial in making us encounter a multitude of life forms, redistributing horizontally, agencies again towards non-human beings, hereby exactly as they wanted to, restoring a receptiveness, an attention, a sensibility for other living beings than humans. Again, the natural living beings that we coexist with and that our own existence depends on. And as we have already seen here, and as many of you have probably already detected elsewhere, then these investigations have certainly been influencing the art world in the last decade with an explosion of artistic explorations and investigations into exactly other forms of existence than that of humans. So again, to sum up the framework I have made, I have no PowerPoint slides, so you will have to imagine. Point 1, by investigating the many sizes, shapes, and silhouettes of other living beings than humans, studies like these, in my opinion, at least, have been very useful in reinstating a set of sensibilities to the non-human beings that we, for way too long, have been desensitized to. Hereby offering us absolutely crucial tools for renegotiating our own understanding of our place in the world, as somebody said before, and of course our relationships with these several life forms that we depend on, coexist, and that we see disappear. But while this way of approaching our time's crisis of sensibilities is important, at least again in my opinion, don't forget that I was educated by Bruno Latour and grew up in this tradition, then I have in recent years become increasingly convinced that it is not the only tradition that we need, or the only analytical approach that we need. At least this is the argument that I wish to forward here today at the Tipping-Point-Konferenz. The argument is that if we wish to understand and fight against the lack of sensibilities that truly characterizes our times, a time of global climatic destruction, we need not only to focus on new descriptions of non-human beings. Instead, what we also need, and what I've been trying to push forward in my recent work, is furthermore narratives, portrayals, descriptions that brings us closer, makes us sensitive to how the human being itself is metamorphosing today, how our own species is changing shape, how it has turned into another existence, how it has turned into another being that is slowly, but I'm afraid certainly, destroying its own species conditions of existence. Again, I'll repeat myself, there is absolutely no question that insensibility towards natural living beings is key to understand our paralysis of action and of affects in terms of the climate. But it also strikes me that the situation we find ourselves in is not only characterized by an insensitivity towards non-humans, it is also characterized by a deficiency in our sensitivities, a lack in our emotional response, an absence in our sensibilities for understanding our own human being and its most violent transformation into a planetary agent. That's my suggestion, that facing our new terrestrial condition today not only involves becoming sensible to other life forms, it also means facing anew ourselves, our own human being, becoming sensitive to ourselves, metamorphosing or mutating into a new, strange creature. Or, to put my hypothesis differently, our times today are not only characterized by a crisis of sensibilities to other living forms than humans, and to a natural world that is mutating, we're also experiencing a crisis of sensibility to what we humans have become. I stand by what I started out by saying, namely that we need a new existentialism. But just like the old 19th and 20th century existentialism was a plural tradition, opening up many different doors, walking down several corridors to understand the conditions of human existence, then a new existentialism, in a similar manner, needs multiple strategies, divisions, branches, when trying to shed light on the many nuances of our terrestrial condition. And again, while one important passage, so to say, as they would say in Paris, around this existential maze is opened up, again by getting sensitive to the lives of non-humans, another needed route of restoring sensibilities comes from describing the dramatically changing psycho-emotional landscape of the human being whose existential compass shatters under the weight of the Anthropocene. Let me try to illustrate a bit better what I mean, with using an example from my book that you can buy over there after we've had a beer. It is one thing, of course, to lay in your bedroom in Paris trying to sleep through yet another boiling night of yet another heat wave, reading on your telephone that roads and Athens are burning, that it's 52 degrees hot in Pakistan, that today, just like yesterday and the day before and the day tomorrow, broke or will break the record of the highest temperatures ever measured on Earth. Tough, indeed, tough enough to make the most sensitive or the least sensitive soul long, to quote Stefan Zweig, for the world of yesterday. That is one thing, but it is another thing to then realize that precisely the ventilator that you might turn on, or the cold shower that you might step into, that allows you to sleep, is making your energy consumption explode, resulting in even more heat, making the situation even worse. A few months later, you might find yourself on a weirdly hot autumn morning in Venice, trying to navigate through the city's narrow passages again, when you suddenly reach another dead end, gazing at the water in the canal. Indeed, you are lost like you were before in this mythic stone maze, but in another way than the last time you visited the city. Why? Because these canal waters mirror you differently. You see your existence mirrored, not because the waters are clear, but because they are dirty, and because the waters are rising due to your own being there. A human who arrived there on a CO2-emitting airplane, a tourist among thousands that are slowly polluting the lagoon and making Venice sink. Now, I'm aware that these examples are completely anecdotal, but what they nonetheless illustrate is how these ecological problems not only follow you in your footsteps wherever you go, whatever you do, eat, drink, sleep, travel, dress, but how they are your footsteps. And as a consequence, philosophically, it makes sense to say that the human being has transformed into another figure, another being than we thought it was. Let us go back to where we started the lecture. The world has turned into something different. But by being the very cause of this transformation, then the human being has certainly also metamorphosed into another kind of existence, an existence that is constantly leaving behind a set of destructive traces as it goes along, that it is constantly reminded of, traces that is endangering its own continuous existence as a species. To rephrase the late Milan Kundera, human is today confronted, I'm afraid, with the unbearable heaviness of being. A being that day by day threatens the planet's conditions of subsistence, and thus its own being's continuous possibilities of a livelihood. I do not know how well navigated you are in existentialism. It's a quite boring tradition. But this is certainly a drama that the old existentialists could not have imagined. Think about it. Today, in our times, the famous painting of the existentialist painter Edvard Munch, The Scream, takes on a completely different meaning than yesterday. Of course, in this image we all remember, the scream and the blood-red sky. Before, the human saw in the blood-red sky a metaphor, a representation for its own anxiety, its own anguish. But today, when you gaze at this fascinating painting, you cannot help but thinking that the human face is distorted by anxiety and by anguish because it has created the blood-red sky. Because it is the cause of it. Because the blood-red sky is the consequence of its own being. From an infinite stream traveling through nature to a finite nature passing through the human screen, or to return to philosophy, today it is not simply that the human existence, its being, its Dasein, is thrown into the world, as Heidegger would say. It is furthermore a human condition that the harmful traces of this being is thrown around. Step by step it takes before returning like a boomerang, destabilizing its own life conditions. So to sum up, the human figure is being transformed simultaneously as the Earth system is spinning out of control. The human being is spinning out of control. Since we are in Germany, I used the term "ich glaub, ich spinne." Exactly because the human is the reason behind the Earth's mutation. The human condition, to go back to the existential question, and its place in the world have simply changed shape. And it is being transformed into another being that I suggest we also need philosophies and arts that can describe, reconfigure our perceptiveness, our attention, and yes, our sensibilities too. This is truly what I am interested in and what I have taken a few steps towards investigating in my recent book, Land Sickness, and I call Landkrank in German. Everything, as I normally say, is always better in German because it sounds more serious. Landkrank. A notion I use to describe exactly this simultaneous shaking of the human being and the earth at the same time. These are the questions. What is the experience? What are the affects? What are the emotions of this metamorphosis of a human being into another being? How does the fractured moral landscape or psycho-experimental, psycho-existential life terrain of the human being looks like as it tries to navigate in a climate-damaged world that continues to be damaged by its own being? What does it mean, to go back to my old patriot, do you say a patriot? Compatriot, Kierkegaard. What does it mean to fear, to tremble in the Anthropocene when you realize that the freedom that you always believed in is threatening your own conditions of existence? What is the nausea? What is the vertigo that comes from realizing that you are simply another being that you were before? Or more generally, what does it mean to be human when the conditions needed to sustain life on Earth is slowly disappearing due to your own being? Again, it is questions like these that I suggest that we need to investigate if we are fully to understand our crisis of sensibilities, all the insensitivities that define our times. To conclude, that is the name of the game. Despite what I indicated above, it is not simply that the existential question today changes from an inquiry into the meaning or the purpose of human existence into an inquiry what beings allows or disallows other beings to exist or not. Instead, a new existentialism should be able to pose both these two questions precisely because they cannot be distinguished anymore. At least that's what I believe is missing in ecology today. I believe they are of utmost importance to understand the human conditions in a time of climate change. Another essential set of sensitivities might be at stake. another necessary way of becoming sensible in the Anthropocene is at stake, as the times are tipping the human condition, so to say. Thank you for your patience.
You talked about the phenomenon of the double shaking of the human and the earth, both at the same time. Have you felt that specific shake today already? And if yes, how do you cope with it?
Wow, I think we all feel it in smaller or larger extents. My argument would not be that we're all constantly shivering from anxiety due to living on apropos football, that is shaken. But that we, all of us, in smaller bits here and there, are somehow touched, somehow affected by having changed shape as human beings. Mm-hmm. You don't go through an airport in the same way as you did 20 years ago.
That's true.
You don't even go through a supermarket the way you do 20 years ago. To use the same example, you don't go to Venice in the same way because you know that you being there is making this sublime, this beautiful place sink. Again, we might still be people are of course always differently psychologically, let's say, disposed and so on and so forth, but I think we all somehow see that something in our, what I would call our life terrain is metamorphosing. Mm-hmm. And I strongly believe that these are effects that will become stronger and stronger the further we go on into this century. So, yes, I took a taxi here instead of walking. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that I was completely like this, but of course you know that just you being in that taxi, it's a transformation of our cosmology and of our own psychological and even moral landscapes that I believe that is smaller or larger degrees constantly traveling in our footsteps. Mm-hmm. Again, to use the same example that I said before, because they are our footsteps. And that's what I'm interested in trying to describe, so to say.
You mentioned in your talk also that you've worked with Bruno Latour for quite a while. There was a few years back, you wrote, I don't know what the correct English title is, of the rise of the ecological class. Is it?
You can use the German title, Zur Entstehung, eine
you like the
Klasse.
German titles, right?
Ich habe Deutsch am Schule gelernt, aber ich kann nicht Deutsch sprechen. Es ist sehr schlecht.
Better than I speak.
On the emergence of an ecological class.
Yes. And
English.
Since then, you've been definitely deemed a shooting star, but now that your essay Landkrank came out, you're actually always said to be like really the new star of sociological thinking.
It says more about sociology. It says about me, I'm afraid, but I shouldn't say that. But
yeah,
it would have been worse if I said, yeah, exactly.
Yes, that would have been worse actually. But in your essay Landkrank, you do something, I guess you consider yourself a scientist. So you do something that is unusual, actually, I think, in the scientific world, because you talk a lot about feelings. Mm-hmm. And a lot of feelings connected to climate change, to the climate crisis, what it does to you. Of course, you can always say that's kind of like a lyrisches Ich. That's not really you who's talking, but in a way it is, I guess. So for you as a scientist, was it weird to actually give way to emotional insights?
Well, I'm a very weird scientist. I'm a scientist in between sociology and philosophy. Well, it's true that I wrote the book very differently than both me and Bruno, and very differently from the academic papers that I wrote. But exactly because I wanted to capture the affects, the experience. Of course, it had to be written not only about feelings, but it had to be written from an I perspective. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you read through the old existentialist traditions, they always mobilize different ways of writing. Mm-hmm. Kierkegaard wrote 400 pages about his own love life, right? So it demanded from me another mode of inquiry. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's also related to a more methodological argument of our times today, because, as I argued, then the Anthropocene is not simply an economic or a scientific crisis. It is a crisis of sensitivities, of sensibilities, a crisis of us not feeling it. That I strongly, in the tradition of somebody like Ursula Le Guin, for example, believe simply demands other ways of writing other modes of telling narratives. Haraway would say the same thing. Other ways of doing science.
Yes.
Simply. So, but yeah, it was a weird book. It was luckily a very short book, so I wrote it very quickly. But also, I don't know if that's interesting, but one of the reasons why I did write it like this was because it actually started out like a very short essay, only 3-4 pages, and I was very touched. I mixed the I narrative with the theory and so on and so forth. It's between the affectual and the theoretical, the academic and the personal and so on and so forth. And I was very surprised that all my friends who are now in the football stadium, for the first time in their life, they were interested in what I was writing. And even my parents, who don't care 1 second about they were interested in it. So I thought that maybe this mode of telling theory would invite other kinds of readers. Yeah. Maybe even if I was lucky enough, make theory being felt.
Yeah.
And but now I have a fixed university position, so I can write whatever I want. I don't have to care anymore.
At the end of your speech, you posed quite a few questions, actually. Especially the question, what does it mean to be human in a world where we are responsible for a lot of species and ultimately ourselves disappearing? I remember a passage in Landkrank.
Oh, do you remember it?
I do.
Or you just wrote it down?
No, I remember it. Where you state, I am with the problem. And in the beginning, I think, of Landkrank, you say, I am the problem. That's a big difference, actually. So is that a glimpse into a possible future to move forward?
Can I see?
Yes.
No, but I never...
I can even show you the page.
I never remember what I write.
Think hard.
I would say both are still true. I am the problem. Of course, now people begin, especially in Germany, it's created quite a disturbing... discussion, because of course the question becomes, is it individual responsibility, is it collective structures that we have to change? I absolutely think that argument is completely silly. You have to fight on both fronts.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never understood that you have to either choose between individual responsibility or if you have to articulate a more structural critique. It's like saying, okay, racism is structural, therefore I can walk around using the N-word. It makes no sense, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, you are the problem. I am the problem. We are active participants in a deteriorating earth by every step we take. It does demand of us to understand, not only on a question of guilt or responsibility, but simply ontologically. Mm-hmm. We have to understand that we are not the same human that we were before, and we are a problematic being.
Yeah.
And if I think that's important philosophically, but also, again, as you indicate, emotionally to describe, it's because I think we're all feeling it somehow. Mm-hmm. And we need a language so we don't just look the other direction. We need to face exactly the problem that we are a part of. So yeah, I would say we are a part of the problem. I am the problem. We are, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that we should put ourselves down in climate anxiety. It means that we have to somehow articulate, describe the anxieties that are already there. That's what the young people that often write me today. The old people say, you're making the young anxious. The young people who write me say, thank you for giving me, say, a language for the confusions that I'm already facing, so to say. I mean, I think that's what I tried to do somehow.
So, listening to your answers right now, the last question that poses itself to me is, have we actually stumbled across a hopeful scientist
Me?
with you?
Hope?
Yes.
Well,
this is where it gets interesting.
No, but it is a very interesting question, because it's very 50-50 if people read that book as completely hopeful or completely the opposite.
Yeah.
I don't know. I never really know what to answer. But somebody wrote me. It was Louisa, actually, my friend Neubauer, the activist, who told me that hope is not like looking out the window hoping something better is around the corner. Hope comes exactly the moment where you have a good description of the problem. Mm-hmm. It comes when you dare to face the issue as it is, because then you know where you are, what you are, and then we can go forward. So I think I wouldn't use the word hope. I would use the word soothing. I don't know what that's called. Maybe it's called, in Danish it's called lindring. Lindring.
Yes.
No?
It is like this.
Because we are all, I think, like confused. We're all shattered inside, upside down in this weird issue. So if we have a little bit more, and of course you can't find that in my book, but if we can all begin to describe what we have become a little bit better, yes, then there might be a certain, if not amount, then like a resonance of hope, I would say.
Die Fragen an Nikolaj Schultz bei der Tipping-Point-Konferenz der Zivilgesellschaft stellte Stefanie Jaksch. Die Konferenz fand zwischen 9. Mai und 11. Mai 2024 in einem Zelt im Sonnenpark in St. Pölten statt. Veranstalter waren die Tangente St. Pölten, Globart und Solektiv. Ich bedanke mich sehr herzlich für das OK zu dieser Übertragung. Ich verabschiede mich von allen, die uns auf UKW zuhören. Grundlegendes und Philosophisches gibt es jede Woche im Falter. Ein Abonnement des Falter kann ich nur empfehlen. Alle Informationen gibt es im Internet unter der Adresse abo.falter.at. Die Signation kommt von Ursula Winterauer. Miriam Hübel und Clara Gottsauner-Wolf betreuen die Audiotechnik im Falter. Ich verabschiede mich bis zur nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falterradio, den Podcast mit Raimund Löw.